A really fun guest today, Weyodi Oldbear of the Comanche Nation. She's an author of 4 different novels, hundreds of poems, numerous speculative fiction and science fiction short stories, and attention to a historical play about her great-great-grandparents. She's also one of the principal writers for the groundbreaking indigenous futuristic tabletop role-playing game, Coyote and Crow. She's joining us again to give a presentation on reframing the future by reframing history. Take it away, Weyodi.
It's Weyodi. What my name is Weyodi Oldbear, and I'm a citizen of the Comanche Nation, and my band is Weyodi. And this is a strange thing to try and explain, but this is a story about stories. And we have to look at the stories that cultures start with, that are basic to how people think, because stories shape how we think about ourselves, about other people, how we frame the world around us, how we interact with the world around us, and even down to how we do science, because it shapes everything. And one of the stories in the US that is kind of pivotal, because non-natives really take it to heart, is that story of the founding of this country as the US. We, of course, Native people were here already, and now we have proof have been here at least 20,000 years. But this story of the founding, of the pilgrims came to this empty place with just very sparsely populated and by very primitive people. And before we can look at that, let's look at what shaped the pilgrims, what shaped those people that came on the Mayflower. And if maybe there's another way to look at that, and maybe there's another way to look at the world other than their worldview. So, what really affected those people and really shaped their worldview? My feeling is that the biggest, longest lasting influence on Europeans and that European worldview was the Romans. They eventually conquered an area that ran from Cornwall to the Sudanese-Egyptian border. And their language is used today as the language of biology with a binomial nomenclature. It's used, still in use in a lot of different ways. Their ruins are still there, their aqueducts and amphitheaters. Their influence still exists in a lot of law and legal language even. So they had a big impact. So who were they? Well, their own stories about themselves. And we have to talk about Europeans from an indigenous point of view here, but also from their own, what they said about themselves was that they were founded by a child literally raised by wolves who became the leader of a group of bandits on the Tiber River. And that they didn't have enough women. It's always a bandit problem, I suspect. And in order to found a lasting city, but also to keep peace among the men, they abducted the women of a nearby tribe. This is often referred to as the abduction or the rape of the Sabine women. And by the time their families were able to make contact, many of them were already married to Romans and had children or were pregnant by members of this bandit gang. And these were the people who conquered Europe. And there were a lot of things that sort of grew out of that. We can talk about you have to look at my notes. Their main goal as colonizers, because they were the guys who really invented colonialism, was to extract resources, to dominate local populations and extract resources. They had a really authoritarian system that had a hierarchy, not only a political hierarchy, but they were so hierarchical that it extended to the family with a thing called paterfamilias, where the father had the power of life and death over every member of the household. There are surviving letters from Roman soldiers telling their wives that if they have a baby girl, that they should expose her and leave her to die. But if they have a son, they can raise him. They had their language, as we said, is throughout, still dominates many cultures, still has in that it is important things. It's in science, it's in the law, and it's a very terse language. And and that's a really important thing, because it's not heavily nuanced the way some languages are. But the biggest thing by far that the Romans brought, in my opinion, is this idea of the dichotomy, which they got from the Greeks, to be fair. But this way of looking at the world that is black and white. You're a Roman citizen or you're a barbarian. You're a man or you're a woman. You have power, you have no power. You're a conqueror or you're conquered. You're good or bad, black or white. It doesn't leave a lot of room for nuance. And that's really in opposition to a lot of, because there's not just one native way of being, but it is in opposition to a lot of native ways of being that are heavily nuanced, where there are many recognized genders, where there are many shades of understanding. But nothing lasts forever, not even the Roman Empire. And as the empire itself began to fall apart, began to unravel, then the tribes, the European tribes, Europe was full of tribal nations, much like this continent was before the Romans swept through. Those tribal nations had really been affected in their thinking by their experience of colonization. One of the things that happened is they all wanted to be the new Rome and conquer their neighbors. Not just, I want this little piece of land, but I want them to speak our language. I want them to do things our way. We want them to cease to exist as a separate people. And that really had a lot to do with the Romans. They also had wanted to extract their neighbors' resources and get what they could from them, to the point of, if the neighbors starve because we've taken all their food, well, that's tough luck. Which is a little different. But one of the biggest ideas they had, which kind of comes from this Roman duality that they had passed on to the rest of Europe, was this idea that the mind and body are separate things. And from that idea of dualism, that the mind and body are two different things, that emotional health doesn't affect physical health, and physical health, it doesn't affect mental health, that the body instead should be subjected to the will of the mind, had a logical, the next logical conclusion for them was that humans are separate from nature, and humans are in effect the mind, and nature is the body, and nature should be subjected to the will of mankind, as opposed to the idea that humans are part of the system of nature, and if we harm and destroy nature, we harm ourselves. No, they thought, well, it's our duty to subdue nature, and we're showing how manly we are, and who is most macho by really subjugating nature. Which brings us kind of back to the story of the Pilgrims, because they very much were of these beliefs. They very much felt that it was, that when you're a kid and you're in literature class, maybe I think you might be in junior high, they go through the list of conflicts. And at the very top of the list is man versus nature. And this was very much how the Pilgrims saw things. And we're taught that here were these pious and persecuted people looking for religious freedom in a new world, risking everything to create a new country in the wilderness. And if there were some natives there, then there were just a few of them, and they were very primitive. And the Europeans won out because they were technologically superior, and maybe we need to look at the evidence about that. First of all, this question of how sparse the population was. When we look at the eyewitness testimony at that time, and we look at the new satellite archaeology, which indicates that the population was much higher, it really tells us a different story. There's more and more proof, more and more evidence that in 1492, the population in the Americas was higher than it was in Europe. Pretty much every European who wrote about seeing Tenochtitlan said it was much bigger than Paris. And Paris was at that time the biggest city in Europe. It had the biggest population. They were also amazed that they weren't ankle deep in raw sewage, which was how it was in every city. Tenochtitlan had people who they had a workforce who cleaned the streets. They had a much better standard of living. Portuguese sailors who fished off the east coast of North America said the entire east coast was a string of towns and cities. It was pretty much an endless string of habitation along that coastline. When Hernan de Soto went from Florida all the way across with 600 men on horse and 300 pigs that kind of served as a traveling meat locker for him, he said that there were walled cities, or he called them great towns, walled great towns, and you could not go from one without being able to see at least 2 or 3 more. Bartolome Las Casas, who was a very interesting fellow, who was a conquistador who spent the first half of his life as a conquistador and the second half as a priest, repenting for his deeds during his first half of his life. He said, it appears that God placed the greater part of the human race there, meaning the Americas. So it was a really populated place. It was not sparse. You know, we have this idea of this great empty continent that just wasn't true. And now, today, the higher range of the estimates of the population is around 100 million people. And that's getting moved upwards all the time, readjusted upwards a lot. And so what happened to them? What happened to all these people? What happened? Well, it's pretty terrible. There were a lot of reasons that, well, there were a lot of diseases that we just hadn't had here. And we were more, people's immune systems were more focused on fighting off parasites. So what happened was, according to the European witnesses, the smallpox hit the population so hard that the villages are depopulated, corpses are scattered in the fields, and lie where they fell in houses, so that the fields go uncultivated, which means that the smallpox epidemic was followed by a famine. And then the famine was followed by an epidemic of typhus, which was followed by an epidemic of influenza, which had not been here before, which was followed by an epidemic of diphtheria, all in less than 100 years. So that's what happened with that. But the other part of that is that there's this idea that we didn't have a lot of contact, that we were isolated from each other, but we weren't. And that's part of the problem with all these epidemics. At one time, we know there was a lot of trade. Tobacco came from the Amazon. And by the time the Europeans arrived, it had already hit. It was widely cultivated on the East Coast. Chaco Canyon, the archaeologists have found an entire room devoted to making hot chocolate. There was a hot chocolate room. There were trade goods from both coasts at Chaco Canyon. So we were trading widely, and we had wide contact with each other, which meant that the disease traveled really quickly. And really, the same diseases that were knocking people out in South and Central America and Mexico, what is now Mexico, quickly came to North America. The other problem is DeSoto. When he came through with those pigs, well, we don't have conclusive evidence, but there is a lot of evidence, a lot of other circumstantial evidence that's a little more than circumstantial, because he had these pigs. There are very few animals you even could domesticate that are capable of being domesticated in North America. The Europeans had been living with animals, usually in their houses. The most Europeans had livestock in their houses. My husband's family were French peasants, and his uncle went back to where they were from, found their old homestead, and they had been dairy keepers. And there was one side of the house where the people lived, and the other side of the house that could pass through easily, it was right there, was a dairy barn. So zoonotic diseases, which means diseases that travel from animals to humans, had been part of these people's lives for over 1,000 years. That wasn't the case with Native people. So when DeSoto came through with all these pigs, some of them left and became the ancestors of the wild hogs that bother us so much in a lot of places. But they also spread illness. We don't know that for a fact, but there are some very strong suggestions. Part of which was, if you look at people like the Caddo, who, when at the time that DeSoto went through, there were over 200,000 Caddo. 100 years later, when LaSalle went through, there were about 5,600. They went from building plazas and big public monuments to building big public cemeteries. So that's what happened to this really huge population. By their own accounts, this is one of the more upsetting things to me because of our issues with our remains being disrespected. But by their own accounts, when the Mayflower got there, arrived at Plymouth Rock, one of the first things they did was go and open up graves and these empty houses, empty villages, searching for food stores. And they came back and they were opening up graves, taking grave goods, and they returned to the Mayflower with 10 bushels of corn that they had gone to from these empty houses. And they actually built Jamestown on the site of Patuxet village where everyone had died. Everyone. It was completely empty except for dead bodies. So this is all to say that the people that the Europeans met and successive waves of European immigrants met as they came and headed west, as they came to this continent and as they headed west, they were not primitive. They were apocalypse survivors. And they were apocalypse survivors, but they still had their culture and they still had their own distinct point of view and their own distinct way of being in the world. And it wasn't just that there was a single alternative point of view, single native alternative point of view. There were hundreds of alternative points of view because every native nation has its own distinct culture and its own distinct way of doing things. However, one thing that's kind of common, that I'm not going to say universal because I don't know every native person and I don't speak for everyone. I don't even speak for all Comanches, but to me, looking at the native people I know and the cultures I've been exposed to, the one thing that we have in common is that not having that dualistic point of view and not seeing ourselves as separate from the system that is nature, not being separated. When I was a little girl in the 1970s, I've now dated officially, apart from losing my makeup, I've now officially dated myself. When I was a little girl growing up in the 1970s, I mostly stayed with my grandparents, my maternal grandparents. And I was my grandmother's sidekick. And we did a lot of different things together. She told me stories all the time, and we went to the Comanche Tribal Elderly Center, and she had a big reel-to-reel, and she collected stories, and I ate cookies and drank coffee with the old people, and we would go out and collect food and medicines, sometimes at the Wichita Mountains, and sometimes just where we saw it. And I read her Dune. We, we spent a lot of time together. But one of the things, and she taught me about things. Sometimes we would gather wild plums, and you would never take all of them because you would leave some for animals, for other people. You never completely stripped everything bare. Sometimes if we saw a fruit tree or something like that had been planted, as you can often see by a bird on a fence line, or that was in a vulnerable position, we would dig it and replant it, but we would not bring it home and replant it. What we did was we would plant it along a tree line along a creek so that it was protected from the Oklahoma winds that will stunt a tree, and so that it had a good source of water, which is important, particularly important in that area. We would gather medicine like sage, and she taught me that there's a grandmother plant there, and you can see which is the grandmother plant, and you never take the grandmother plant. You never take that one. You would always take the young plants from around the outside. And you didn't take them all. You just basically did it like you were thinning the plants, making more room for the other plants to grow. And at the time when I would talk about this to my teachers, they were like, oh, how hokey and how spiritual, and but that really has no basis in science. So what's funny now is that a couple of things about that. This was not just her. I'm coming to find out. Researchers from Fraser University have discovered that British Columbian tribes in BC, in Canada, did something very similar, and they moved plants sometimes hundreds of miles to create food gardens, in forest food gardens. And oral tradition says that this was practiced by tribes all over. What's fascinating about this is that we now know that this practice is actually better agriculture, because you're keeping the carbon in the soil. This is just really groundbreaking science going on right now, but we know that plants communicate with each other. Sometimes through microbes, but more often through the vast nets of fungus. The mushrooms are only the fruiting body of fungus, and there are huge networks of fungus underground, and through these networks, plants actually send messages to one another, and larger plants often direct nutrients to their offspring through the fungal networks that fascinatingly resemble, when you map out the internet, look a lot like the internet. So mother plants are feeding their offspring. So all these things that my grandmother said to me, years and years ago, are true. The plants are not, everything is connected, and it really is connected. She said everything is connected, and it really truly is. And these are the things that our elders taught us, and they weren't just, they weren't just talking out of their backsides. They were telling us a true thing. And we're connected to the plants, and the plants are connected to each other, and everything is interdependent. When we practice that kind of extraction, it doesn't work so well. But the other part of this is that when we plow, when we do a traditional European style of agriculture, and we plow and we have monoculture, which is, I mean, it's kind of funny because these early Europeans on the quote unquote frontier, which was not a wilderness at all, said, oh, it's so beautiful. It's like a Garden of Eden prepared for us. Well, no, this was just a better form of agriculture, but they couldn't recognize it because it wasn't in a row. It wasn't monoculture. So, you know, the CO2, it just functioned better. And the carbon is not the bad guy. We need carbon in the plants and in the soil. Trees run on carbon, but we don't need it in the air. We need it in the plants and in the ground. But when we plow in the traditional Western agricultural model, what happens is you release all that carbon being held in the quote unquote weeds, and you are no longer putting the moisture into the air. That cellular respiration puts moisture and oxygen into the air. It pulls out carbon, 60% of which is used by plants and 40% of which goes into the soil. Well, when you break that soil, that 40% is coming back up. When you use a plow and break that soil, 40% that is diverted into the soil by the trees, by whatever you're planting, is released back up into the atmosphere, which is where we don't need it. So where are we now? Let's talk about, what I always get ahead of my notes. But the traditional indigenous agriculture was something different. People talk a lot about Three Sisters gardening, but that's only that's a really simple, short way of explaining it. The truth is that, you know, what was done in a lot of places, you know, people did different things according to where they were, but one of the methods was to burn a small area, to plant it with a low canopy of corn, beans, and squash. The nitrogen from the beans helping the corn and the squash to grow, as well as you would also have tubers, herbs, and other, you know, give you a well-balanced diet, but also support one another, because companion planting really works and it enriches the soil. And after 2 to 3 years of that, you would plant quick growing trees, fruit trees. And then finally, in the final stage of that, after the fruit trees had been going for a while, you would plant hardwoods, which eventually would return it to the forest, so that you would have a cycle going on, because you would have these gardens at different stages of development. And they actually produce much more. The forest gardens produce much more and are more productive than the traditional monocultural system. So my grandmother was right, but that wasn't what we'd been doing for a long time. In a lot of westernized countries and colonized countries, what had been happening was monoculture that wears out the soil and wears out the soil and releases more carbon, et cetera, which brings me to poor Fritz Haber, who was, I don't want to blame Fritz. He had bad luck. His life was hard. If he hadn't done it, someone else would have, but he's a really key figure in talking about this. He won the Nobel Prize in 1918 for synthesizing ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen. And He did a bunch of things, some of them great, some of them he was trying to help, some of them he was trying to be a good citizen. But he was a Jewish German, and he contributed to chemical warfare in World War I. He invented a system, he invented nitrogen fertilizer. And his laboratories, no one knows how much part he played in it or not. He invented Zyklon A as a pesticide, from which Zyklon B was eventually made. It's just very sad. One of his own children died in the gas chambers. And he himself said that nature, with her, her nitrogen bacteria, has more sophisticated forms, knows and utilizes more than we can ever imitate. So he knew that really he was on the right track, but he went so wrong. A lot of older farmers I've talked to have said, when you put more nitrogen in, using chemical nitrogen over their lifetimes, they just keep having to add more and more. The trouble is the pesticides that were brought over after World War II, the pesticides that we started really using after World War II, because of the Dust Bowl, which it all goes further and further back. But the dust, they said rain follows the plow. The plow, it's actually the opposite. Rain doesn't follow the plow. The plow actually lessens rain because there's less moisture put into the air, because you're lessening the amount of cellular respiration going on. So what happens is you've got these really stressed out grasshoppers. And what happens when you stress out grasshoppers? You get locusts. You get this terrible pest. So what did they do? They sprayed pesticides on them. Well, what did the pesticides do? They killed the microbes in the soil even more. They were more destructive and so the soil got even more degraded. So they added the nitrogen, then they put more pesticides on it. And what's going on in large parts of the world, huge parts of the world, is desertification, which is fertile farmland being turned into deserts. But this is the thing, we have a choice. We can change the story to where we're not trying to conquer nature, where we're seeing ourselves as part of it, where we're looking at the system, and we have all the technology to do it right now. All we need to do is have the will to change the story we're telling. And make the earth fertile again, take the carbon. We could actually, at this point, some people think we could more than take care of the carbon that we're producing. There's some argument about that. But if we changed our agriculture, nothing but our agriculture, we could probably offset the amount of carbon we're putting in the air right now. It wouldn't take care of what we've already got in there, but we could get to zero, which is a starting place. But the fact is that all we have to do is change our thinking. All we have to do is change the story about how we function in the world. Are we separate from nature, or are we part of it? All we have to do is make that decision, change the paradigm, change the story to where we're not outside of nature, but a part of it. And that's why I'm a writer, because I want to change how people think about things, about each other, about themselves, and about the world around them. So I'm ready for questions. If we have questions, thank you. Well, thank you. I guess we don't have any questions. Anyone want to jump on? But that's where we are. And there's more and more evidence of the food gardens and the population and et cetera, et cetera. Oh, there was a story I meant to work in, and I never could figure out how to work it in. When we were talking about primitive, this idea that natives were so primitive. At the Battle of Adobe Walls, which is not, mostly the time frame I've been talking about in this talk, but at the Battle of Adobe Walls, at this same time period, throughout the US and and Europe and all of Europe, there was a battle raging about surgeons washing their hands. And they were insulted and they refused to wash their hands. They thought it was an insult. But at the Battle of Adobe Walls, there was a young man who was shot in the stomach. And now, if he had been a white person, a Comanche man who was shot in the stomach, if he had been a white person and gone to any kind of European trained doctor, it would have been a foregone conclusion that he would die. But this young man was a Comanche man, and in the midst of the battle, while it was raging, there was with them a highly gifted Comanche doctor who was renowned among our people, named Bakia, and Bakia asked the other men to give up their water, as much water as they could spare, and he washed his hands and he took the perforated section of the young man's intestines out and resectioned his bowels with his sewing kit in the midst of the battle. And the young man, and then sewed the young man shut. And the young man not only survived, but went on to become, after we came into captivity, he became a Comanche policeman and frequently rode with Bass Reeves, with the lawman, with the man Bass Reeves, and they were work partners off and on through the years. And he was a very respected man. And that's a story about how primitive we were. We also had cataract surgery and lots of other things. It was very interesting. Anyway, thank you.